what it means to be a learning system in the national security field, because that's really what we're talking about here. That's exactly what this conversation has led us to, is how do we see what's happening, learn from it, change, adapt, innovate to find that best fit with the current environment and the future environment. Michael?
Well, you know, Sheila and I met about 5 years ago, and we've been kind of partners in crime. I've been learning about her from her work over the last 2 decades, and as a person coming up in a culture, a professional culture that I think has as its center the customer foremostly. And as a culture in the military of one being very learning, I wanted to come out of the military when my time came and try to find ways to bring that to this broader collection of citizens in our public sector. And but I also know there's a great deal in the private sector that's already getting a lot of this, and so for me it's a life journey. And I'm at one little step in the staircase, and Sheila's helped bring a lot of that private sector thought to me. And she and I started thinking about a system of capabilities. We actually put together a set of proposals that might get to your question, which is a set of capabilities that Sheila has been leading on for a number of years, and that is to, it won't fix everything, but if we know these systems here in the town are somewhat dysfunctional for a variety of reasons, could we help bring a little bit of coherence to that, and specifically in the areas of foresight, visioning, and strategy making. You can pick any word you want, but that kind of thing, and bringing it to the offices of the presidency and the executive branch with the legislative branch. And some of our proposals we talk about bringing the governorships in to make it even more kind of systematic. We've got some proposals that I think we could classify as kind of spaghetti on the wall. It needs to go through a design process, quite frankly, where it's iterated multiple times with bright people who bring in all the other perspectives that we can't possibly have alone. You know, Sheila's done a lot more collaboration on these things than I have, and it's our thought, I think, that might, if such an improvement were made in this town, then we might have left a tiny little mark towards making the place a little more of a learning and more learning system. And we can certainly talk about the details of a proposal that we have, and I think after this we're actually leaving to go talk to some folks who might be interested in helping us move towards prototyping, because you can only do so much through just thinking about it. You need to really start building cardboard boxes and role-playing and do stuff, and, and then get it out into some smaller places for piloting and so forth. But I will not take any more time on the details of that unless you want to ask some questions. But Sheila, I don't know if and I don't even know if I'm really answering your question of how do we get a more learning system set up here.
Yes. Well, I think that I was very lucky in my life to start out going down one path and becoming a physicist and mathematician, and then turning almost 180 degrees and becoming a social scientist at the graduate level, so that I had a chance to look at systems in nature, both physical and then biological and then social, along this huge spectrum of what today we would call natural systems of any kind. And one thing that was very clear to me as I began to work in very large organizations and large institutions, whether they were in the private sector or they were in the public sector, didn't really matter. What mattered was that those organizations understood the world that they lived in, they understood themselves, and they understood who they were and where they were going and how they were going to get there. And something that is that basic, you would think is a it's intuitively obvious. Well, guess what? It is not intuitively obvious. If you ask bureaucrats today who they are as an organization and where they're going and how they're going to get there, they have a very skewed notion. Many of them don't even know what their mission is. They may understand what the words are on the wall that somebody has put there, but they have not really internalized what it means for them, especially within the context of a different world. And I think most of us who have lived, many years and have grown up, many of us grew up in the Cold War, and that all changed with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But none of us really understood the ramifications of that. We're still coming to grips with the ramifications of that. And yet, whatever the world is going to evolve into, we don't know how we're going to get there. What I do know is that there are 4 kinds of systems in the natural world. There are simple systems, there are complicated systems, there are complex systems, and there are chaotic systems. And you have to understand how those systems can behave. Not just how you want them to behave, because you can't create a law that says, okay, my system is going to do this, it's going to control this, we're going to predict that. Well, guess what? The real world doesn't work that way. But the public servants who many of us are trying to work for and the bureaucracies we serve have very little understanding of that. And so it's almost in the classic C.P. Snow sense of the 2 cultures. We have to get multiple cultures to come together to learn that the only systems that survive over time, whether they're civilizations or they're amoebas in a petri dish, can evolve to accommodate to their changing environment. And the only way we are going to survive this evolution we are in is we have to outlearn our competitors. At a minimum, we have to be learning as quickly as they are. And we have to be adapting our institutions so that we can all be successful, hopefully, in a co-evolutionary sense, so that we don't destroy the planet we're on, we don't destroy one another's civilizations, and we find a way to live together in the real world.
And what are some of the methods for doing that adaptation that you have seen be successful?
Actually, I've seen many. Some of them begin with system mapping so that at least you begin to understand the complexities involved. I've had experiences with CEOs of Fortune 10 companies who, when I'd ask them to define their system, they'd say, oh, well, of course I can define my system. And, by the time they really started exploring what their system was, they found it took months to figure out the complexity of their system. I went through this process at Ford Motor Company where the CEO looked at me and said, I know my system very well, but it took him and a staff of people, literally months, to figure out all of the relationships, just the formal relationships that they were in, between global dealer networks, joint ventures all over the world. It was just amazing to them. When they finally looked at the system map, it was huge. And it involved literally millions and millions of people. Well, the same is true, only more so, for the US federal government. And yet, something as simple as a system map can begin to be useful in helping people understand. It's amazing how much more different a person's mental model and worldview will change when they meet somebody who has a different one. And I think that, that's just an example of the kinds of mechanisms, and I believe, I am a true optimist. I think that we already have the technology to do this. The question is, do we have the political will? And do we get the right people listening to these kinds of ideas so that they can begin to understand that, you know, it isn't just an issue of power. It isn't just an issue of what committee in Congress you are chairing. You always have a responsibility for the larger whole. And as Richard Myers said to me one day, "Oh, Sheila, this is going to be so hard." And I said to him, "But sir, doesn't the nation deserve better? We know how to do this. Why don't we try?" And he agreed. So I think it's doable.